Hi everyone. My name is Ember Rosopoulos. I am in group 2 of personality psychology, and I'm working with Lily, Emma, Paige, Irene, and Ariana. Our topic for this project is social connection, and we will be exploring it through the 5 basic approaches. That is the trait approach, the biological approach, phenomenological, cognitive, and adjustment approaches. I'm going to start us off today with the trait approach, and then we will get into the rest. So let's start with the foundation. What exactly is the trait approach? Well, the trait approach is the most common approach when it comes to personality psychology. It focuses on the relatively stable traits or characteristics that shape how we think, feel, and behave. The key word here is stable, because unlike mood or a reaction to a specific situation, traits are consistent tendencies that remain with us across situations and over time. Now, before we really get into it, I want to make sure that we all have a sort of idea of the framework that we're going to be using, and that is the Big Five model, or sometimes called OCEAN, as it is seen as OCEAN. This includes openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So high scores on openness to experience are usually associated with curiosity, creativity, and flexibility. In terms of conscientiousness, it's associated with responsibility, organization, self-discipline. Extroversion is associated with sociability, enthusiasm, and overall positive emotions. Agreeableness is associated with kindness, trust, and cooperation. And then finally, neuroticism is typically known to come with anxiety, emotional reactivity, and overall negative emotions. So that is the OCEAN model, or the Big Five. And then we have the Hexaco model down here, which adds a 6-factor. That 6-factor is honesty and humility, and this came about from cross-cultural research as people kept finding this 6th dimension emerging across different languages and cultures. What honesty and humility captures is things like sincerity, fairness, and a tendency to avoid manipulation. So these things are going to be referred back to throughout our lecture. We're going to go over a few questions in order to understand social connection on the trait level. And that first one is, to what extent does extroversion influence the quantity versus the quality of social relationships? Well, extroversion is probably the trait that is most associated with social connection, and this is for a good reason. High extroversion is linked to a lower threshold for experiencing social activities as enjoyable and motivating. So extroverts seek out social situations. They tend to be more popular, and they report higher positive emotions in social settings. A study done by Jane and Singh in 2004 looked at 100 college students and found a significant positive correlation between extroversion and relationship satisfaction. The more extroverted someone was, the more satisfied they reported being in their relationships, largely because extroverts tend to bring enthusiasm and positivity into their interactions and are just generally more communicative. So, knowing this, my question was, does having more social connections actually mean deeper ones? Well, a 2021 study done by Malcolm and colleagues sampled 199 people and looked at 3 things. They looked at network size, network density, and emotional closeness. And what they found was that extroversion significantly predicts network size, but it does not necessarily predict emotional closeness or intimacy. So extroverts, they may have more people in their lives, but they aren't necessarily forming deeper bonds. There's actually a trade-off that I found, and that is the larger your network, the less emotional investment you are able to give to each individual relationship. And this matters because it means that being low in extroversion is not a disadvantage. People who prefer smaller social settings often build relationships that are much greater in depth. So, to answer that first question, more connections do not equal deeper connections. And that takes us to question 3, and that is, how do trait profiles shape behavior across different relationship types? So I wanted to look at how traits differ between romantic, platonic relationships or in social contexts, professional context, I mean. Um, Traits don't play out the same in every relationship. What matters most in romantic relationships looks different from what matters in a friendship or a professional context. In romantic relationships, the research consistently points to agreeableness and conscientiousness as the most important traits for satisfaction and stability. High agreeableness means being friendly, kind, and preferring to resolve conflicts in mutually beneficial ways. High conscientiousness means being dependable and emotionally consistent. These are the traits that actually sustain a relationship over time, not just attract people to each other. And then if we look at platonic friendships, openness and extroversion play a much bigger role. So high openness predicts a broader, more diverse social network. People high in openness find differences genuinely interesting rather than uncomfortable. Extroverts are more popular and actively seek out social situation, which naturally expands their networks. But again, emotional closeness within these friendships, it's not determined by the extroversion. It's determined by agreeableness. So this shows us something really important, and that is agreeableness acts as a buffer across all relationship types. Two people with mismatched traits are far more likely to navigate that difference successfully if both are high in agreeableness. This is because agreeableness determines how you handle friction, not just whether or not you're pleasant to be around. And then finally, this brings us to a person environment fit. And that is that we as people actively select situations consistent with our traits. And then our traits evoke certain responses from others. What this does is it creates consistent social environments that reinforce who we already are. So your personality isn't just responding to your social world, but it is constantly reshaping it. Question number 5 is no, slide number 5. Question number 3 is how do traits filter social perception? And what does this mean for how we experience connection? So this one challenges a basic assumption that we often make, and that is two people in the same situation or same conversation are having the same experience, because they're not sometimes. Every social interaction gets filtered through your personality before you consciously process it. And we're going to look at 3 traits specifically here. Starting with neuroticism, this means you have a lower threshold for negative emotions, so anxiety, stress, and fear. That lower threshold doesn't just affect how you feel, it affects how you interpret ambiguous social information. So someone high in neuroticism receives a short and neutral text that says, sounds good. They read it as cold, distant, maybe even angry. Someone low in neuroticism, though, reads the exact same text as completely normal. Neither person is wrong. That's just their trait is genuinely generating a different interpretation of identical information. And then if we look at agreeableness gives you a positive orientation towards others. High scores default to charitable interpretations of ambiguous behaviors, whereas low scores are more likely to interpret the same moment as competitive or like self-serving. And then lastly, openness, it allows for flexibility. So high scores can sit with ambiguity and generate multiple possible interpretations, whereas low scores tend to fall back on familiar frameworks, seeing what they expect to happen rather than what actually is happening. So the main takeaway here is pretty significant, and that is connection is connection is built not just on what actually happens between two people, but on what each person perceives as happened. And those perceptions are trait filtered. So miscommunication isn't always about bad intentions, but sometimes it is a structural thing where two people with different trait profiles genuinely experience the same moment in totally different ways. And then my 4th question, it flips kind of in a different direction. Going back here. And that is, can social relationships actually change our personality traits over time? And the answer is yes, both ways, actually. Now, we usually think of traits as just like the input, the thing that shapes our relationships, but relationships are also developmental contexts that can gradually shift who we are and how those traits express themselves. There are three pathways here, and the first is exploring new behavioral patterns. So, when you're in a long term relationship, you start adjusting your behavior based on what works. If your partner responds better when you're gentle, you practice being gentle, and over time, it becomes who you are. Brent Roberts calls this the social investment principle, and this is when you invest deeply in a social role, the demands of that role can gradually reshape your personality. We see this also in data. It is shown that entering a first romantic relationship is associated with an increase in extroversion and a decrease in neuroticism. So that's number one. And then number two is social perception shapes self concept. And basically, that means that the way other people treat you starts to shape how you see yourself. If everyone around you is treating you like you're trustworthy and warm, you start to become that person more fully. Relationships don't just reflect your personality, but they can actually build it, amplify the traits, or they can de amplify and shut them down. And third, loneliness feeds back into traits. So, chronic loneliness can actually change your personality over time, which is kind of a heavy thing to look at, but it tends to increase neuroticism, decrease agreeableness, and extroversion, which makes it even harder to connect with people. So, the loneliness deepens, and then there's a cycle that's continuing. The big takeaway here is that traits are not just inputs, they're also outputs. The relationship isn't just a consequence of who you are, but it's part of what makes you who you are. And then that takes us to the fifth and final question, and that is how do traits shape what we need from social connection and who experiences loneliness and why? So, most people assume that loneliness is just about how many connections you have. The trait approach tells us, though, something is a little bit more nuanced than that. Think about two people with the same social life. They have the same size friend group, same amount of time spent with others. One feels fulfilled, and the other one feels like depleted and lonely. And I want to know why this is. So we're going to look at two things here. The first is extroversion and environmental fit. So someone high in extroversion, again, has a lower threshold for enjoying social activity. They need that large, active social environment to feel satisfied, where someone lower in extroversion has a higher threshold. The same environment feels overwhelming rather than energizing. But if you swap these two situations, put them in both people in a small, intimate group of friends, and now the roles have switched completely. What this shows us is the trait determines what kind of social environment feels like enough. And then we'll look at neuroticism and perceptual distortion. So, a person high in neuroticism can have a rich, loving social network and still feel profoundly alone. And this is because their trait filters their perception of it. The lower threshold for negative emotions means that you are more likely to notice gaps, misread signals, and feel like their need for connection isn't being met, even when objectively it is. And then this is what brings up what I think is most important from this whole lecture, and that is having connection and feeling connected are not the same thing. So, for someone high in neuroticism, the problem isn't always the relationship themselves, it's actually the filter in which those relationships are experienced. And then this filter trait stays through them throughout their lives because it is a trait. And then to wrap things up and bring everything together, I'm just going to say the trait approach gives us a genuinely complex answer to why people connect so differently. Traits shape how we behave, and then our behavior builds relationships. Those relationships over time reshape our traits, and all of that is filtered through our perception, which means two people can be in the same moment and experience it entirely differently. Understanding this doesn't just help us understand personality psychology, but it is so applicable to our lives, and it helps us understand others better and maybe ourselves. So I hope that this part of the lecture gave you a good idea on how the trait approach, just a few ways that the trait approach explains social connection, and we will continue with the rest of them. Thank you.